You are listening to Anglo-Saxons, History of the Germanic Inhabitants of England. Written by Callie Mass and narrated by Chris Newman. Chapter 1. Who were the Anglo-Saxons? In the early Middle Ages, the Anglo-Saxons were a cultural group that resided in England. They traced their roots back to the arrival of incomers to Britain in the 5th century, who originated from the North Sea coastlands of continental Europe. The ethnogenesis of the Anglo-Saxons, on the other hand, happened in Britain, and the identity wasn't just imported. The contact between getting in groups of people from some Germanic tribes, both amongst themselves and with native British population, led to the facility of an Anglo-Saxon identity. A lot of the native tribes ultimately incorporated and embraced Anglo-Saxon society and language. The Anglo-Saxons established the idea of England and the Kingdom of England, and while the modern English language owes practically 26% of its vocabulary to them, this includes the great bulk of words used in daily discussion. The Anglo-Saxon period in history describes the period in Britain from roughly 450 and 1066, starting with their preliminary settlement and ending with the Norman conquest. Let's have a look at how this time period has influenced European history and what else was so significant about the Anglo-Saxon civilization. The early Anglo-Saxon period saw the birth of an English country, with lots of the functions that are still in use today, like shires and hundreds. Christendom was formed at the time of this time period, and literature and language thrived. There were other charters and laws enacted. The name Anglo-Saxon describes the language spoken and written by Anglo-Saxons in England and southeastern Scotland from the mid-5th century till the mid-12th century. It's most typically described as Old English in scholastic circles. The Anglo-Saxons' history is the story of a cultural identity. It emerged from varied factions in reaction to the people's conversion to Christendom and played a key role in the facility of many kingdoms. That identity was re-established after being threatened by the Danish Viking raids and army rule of eastern England. It controlled till the Norman conquest. In structure, dress style, brightened text, metalwork, and other art, Anglo-Saxon material civilization can still appear. There are significant parts of people and lordship relationships between the metaphorical nature of these cultural markers. The gentility announced themselves kings, built burghs, and specified their positions and tribes in scriptural terms. Above all, regional and prolonged kin groups stayed, the fundamental system of production during the Anglo-Saxon period, as Helena Hamerow has revealed. The effects can still be seen in the 21st century, as a 2015 research study found that the hereditary makeup of British residents now displays departments of the early Anglo-Saxon period's tribal political groupings. In the 8th century, the name Anglo-Saxon was created to separate Germanic tribe in Britain from those on the continent, in Latin, and on the continent, Old Saxony and Anglia in northern Germany. In her remark that mindsets to Anglo-Saxons, and for this reason the analysis of their civilization and history, have been more dependent on present political and spiritual dogma than any kind of evidence, Catherine Hill summarizes the viewpoints of many contemporary scientists. Chapter 2. Early Timeline and Historic Introduction. It is now mostly acknowledged that the Anglo-Saxons were the outcome of insular interactions and adjustments instead of transferred Germanic intruders and inhabitants from the continent. Gildas points out that at some point in the 5th century, a council of leaders in Britain consented to give the Saxons some land in the east of southern Britain in exchange for a treaty, a foedus, in which the Saxon would protect the Britons against attacks from the Picts and Scoti in exchange for food supplies. The British provinces, which had experienced different beats and catastrophes, are lowered to Saxon control, according to the Chronica Gallica of 452, which states for the year 441, the British provinces which had suffered different beats and bad luck are lowered to Saxon rule. This is an earlier date than the 451 given by Bede in his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, written around 731, for the arrival of the Saxons. It has been suggested that Bede misread his minimal sources and that the Historia Bretonum's sequential recommendations point to a date of around 428. Gildas defines how a battle broke out between the Saxons and the regional occupants, called the War of the Saxon Federates, by historical analyst Nick Hyman, and concluded quickly after the siege of Mons Badonicus, the Saxons went back to what they called their eastern home. The peace is defined by Gildas as a challenging divorce with the barbarians. According to Hyman, the cost of peace was a much better agreement for the Saxons, enabling them to gather homage from people all over Britain's lowlands. This earlier time frame is supported by historical information. The work of Catherine Hills and Sam Lucy on the proof of Spung Hill has pushed the settlement's chronology back to before 450, with a ton of artifacts now in stages before Beda's date. The idea of the Anglo-Saxons wielding considerable political and army supremacy at an early date is still disputed. Kenneth Dark proposes that the sub-Roman elite lasted in culture, politics, and army power till about 570, which is the most detailed vision of a connection in sub-Roman Britain, with power over its own political and army fate for well over a century. Bede, on the other hand, identifies 3 stages of settlement: an expedition stage, throughout which mercenaries came to safeguard the regional population, a migration stage, throughout which Anglo-Saxons started to control parts, as suggested by Bede's declaration about the tribe origins, and a facility stage, throughout which Anglo-Saxons started to control parts. Scholars are split on the number of migrants who got in Britain throughout this time period. Herke claims that the number is someplace between 100,000 and 200,000. Up to 200,000 beginners, according to Brian Ward Perkins. According to Catherine Hales, the figure is closer to 20,000. According to a computer system estimation, a migration of 250,000 people from mainland Europe could have taken as low as 38 years. Current hereditary and isotopic examinations have exposed that the migration, which comprised both males and females, lasted some centuries, possibly enabling even more new arrivals than initially expected. Anglo-Saxon groups had developed themselves in southern and eastern Britain by the year 500. By the start of the 5th century, Herke and Michael Wood estimate that the British population in the area that ultimately ended up being Anglo-Saxon England was approximately 1 million. Nevertheless, what happened to the Britons is a topic of contention. The conventional clarification for their historical and linguistic disappearance is that the Anglo-Saxons killed them or drove them to the mountain borders of Britain. a concept backed by the few readily available texts from the time. Though there's proof of connection in landscape and regional governance systems, which at the very least in parts of England decreases the chance of such a destructive incident, scholars have proposed different, less violent theories for how the Anglo-Saxon culture, whose main areas of massive settlement was very likely limited to what's now southeastern England, East Anglia, and Lincolnshire, became extensive across lowland Britain. Herke has proposed a situation in which the Anglo-Saxons outbred the Britons as they broadened westward, ultimately leading to their descendants making up a larger part of the population of what would end up being England. It has also been suggested that upsurges getting there through Roman trade paths disproportionately affected Britons, which, in addition to a major emigration to Armorica, could have substantially decreased their population. In spite of all of this, most history experts concur that the kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria housed a substantial population of Britons. It is mostly acknowledged that the native people made it through to a higher degree in the north of England than in the south, according to Herke, and that in Bernicia, a little number of immigrants might have supplanted the regional British upper class and taken control of the kingdom as a going-on business. In the meantime, proof for the residents in Wessex might be found in King Ena's late 7th century legislation, which provided them less opportunities and a lower position than the Saxons. This could have offered a reward for the kingdom's Britons to adopt Anglo-Saxon culture. Speaking Old English without Latin or Brittonic inflection had massive value in conditions when freedom at law, approval with the kindred, access to patronage, and the use and possession of weapons were all limited to the ones that could declare Germanic origin, Hyman writes. There is proof that the rising Anglo-Saxon elite classes were impacted by the British. Cerdic, a clearly Celtic name comparable to Cerdic, the name of two British emperors, eventually stemmed from Corotkos, is said to have created the Wessex imperial line. That could suggest that Cerdic was a native Briton whose dynasty later got Anglicized. Numerous of Cerdic's supposed descendants, like the Bretwalda Sioan, had Celtic names. King Caedwalla, who passed away in 689, was the last member of this dynasty to bear a Brittonic name. Some rulers in Mercia, most significantly Penda, have names that sound Celtic. The Celtic name Caedbad appears in the list of kings as far east as Lindsey. Current hereditary research has revealed that the family tree of the modern English people includes substantial contributions from both Anglo-Saxon migrants and Romano-British natives, based upon information gathered from the skeletons recuperated in Iron Age, Roman, and Anglo-Saxon age cemeteries. The Ceorl's position and freedoms, tinier tribal parts coalescing into bigger kingdoms, the elite developing from warriors to kings, and Irish monasticism developing under Finian, who had sought advice from Gildas, and his pupil Columba all added to the development of civilization in the last half of the 6th century. The Anglo-Saxon farms of this period are often incorrectly identified as peasant farms. A Ceorl, on the other hand, wasn't a peasant, but an arms-owing male with the support of a kindred, access to law, and a Wyrgild, situated at the pinnacle of an extended family cultivating at the very least one hide of land in early Anglo-Saxon society. With the payment of a lease or duty to an overlord who provided only small lordly input, the farmer had freedom and rights over his holdings. Most of this land was common outfield arable land, part of an outfield-infield system that enabled people to form family and cultural links. The tribal hidaj includes 35 tribes, or tribe, with evaluations in hides, which might have initially been specified as the amount of land needed to support one single family. The hidaj's ranks are based upon the province's relative sizes. Regardless of their distinctions in size, all 35 tribes of the tribal hidaj had the exact same statutes in that they were part governed by their own noble family or imperial homes, and so examined individually for homage payment. Bigger kingdoms had developed themselves on the south and east coasts by the end of the 6th century. The Jutes of Hampshire and Wight, the South Saxons, Kent, the East Saxons, East Angles, Lindsey, Dara, and Bernicia, north of the Humber, are amongst them. A region fixated a previous Roman civitas might have been the preliminary focus of numerous of these kingdoms. By the end of the 6th century, the leaders of these settlements were describing themselves as kings, though this doesn't necessarily mean that they were all of Germanic descent. The Bredwalda concept has been used to prove the existence of some early Anglo-Saxon worthy families. In his Bredwalda, Bede appears to be suggesting that leaders have the potential to draw out homage overall and or secure small districts, which could or might not have been reasonably short-term in any given example. In an alternate but crucial and powerful roll call of martial elites, seemingly Anglo-Saxon dynasties rotated in this function. Importantly, these dynasties kept their claim to management by extended family and potentially famous ties, no matter their beginnings or when they grew. They all just happened to be related back to Woden, Helen Geek says. The Christian conversion process. Columba, an Irish monk who studied under Saint Finian at the monastic school of Mobile, came on Iona in 565 as a self-imposed exile. The Abbey of Iona would turn into an abnormally substantial spiritual empire, according to Peter Brown, that covered from western Scotland deep into the heart of Ireland and to the southeast. It reached down during northern Britain thanks to the impact of its sister Abbey Lindisfarne. Columba passed away in the month of June 597. Augustine landed on the island of Thanet at this period and went to King Thelbert's capital, Canterbury. When Pope Gregory the Great picked him to lead the Gregorian exploration to Britain in 595 to Christianize the Kingdom of Kent from their native Anglo-Saxon paganism, he was the previous of an abbey in Rome. Kent was most likely chosen simply because Thelbert had wed Bertha, daughter of Cheribert I, king of Paris, a Christian princess who was expected to have some impact on her spouse. Thelbert was converted to Christianity, churches were put up, and the kingdom started to transform on a bigger scale. The first recorded code in any Germanic language, Thelbert's Law for Kent, developed an intricate system of fines. Thelbert might have introduced regal authority over trade, since Kent was rich and had strong trading relations to the continent. At the time of his reign, coins distributed in Kent for the first time after the Anglo-Saxon intrusion. Aidan, an Irish monk from Iona, chose the island of Lindisfarne to build an abbey near King Oswald's primary stronghold of Bamberg in 635. When Oswald tried to be sent out on an objective to Christianize the kingdom of Northumbria from their native Anglo-Saxon paganism, He was at the abbey in Iona. Oswald had more than likely chosen Iona because after his dad was assassinated, he left to southwest Scotland, where he met Christianity, and returned determined to transform Northumbria. Aidan was a great success in propagating the Christian faith, and because Aidan could not speak English and Oswald had learned Irish at the time of his exile, Oswald worked at Aidan's interpreter when he preached. Saint Cuthbert, Northumberland's tutelary saint, was a monk at the abbey and later ended up being bishop of Lindisfarne. The first extant piece of English historic writing is a confidential life of Cuthbert written at Lindisfarne, and a gospel, referred to as the St. Cuthbert Gospel, was put in his casket in his memory. The earliest undamaged European binding is an ornamental leather book binding. The Synod of Whitby was organized in 664, and it developed Roman practice as the standard in Northumbria, rather than Irish custom, in tonsure style and Easter dates, and consequently drew the Northumbrian Church into the mainstream of Roman civilization. Northumbrium's episcopal seat was moved from Lindisfarne to York. Wilfrid, the Roman position's leading supporter, went on to end up being Bishop of Northumbria, while Colman and the Ionian followers who refused to desert their ways pulled back to Iona. Supremacy of the Mercians. Middle Lowland in Latin Mercia, Britain, was called the land of Mercia, or border or frontier people. Mercia was a heterogeneous series of tribe, as the tribal Hidage shows. Individuals were a mix of Brittonic-speaking tribes and Anglo-Saxon leaders, and their early leaders had Brittonic names like Penda. Regardless of the fact that Penda doesn't appear in Bede's list of great overlords, it seems that he ruled over the southern kingdoms based upon what Bede states somewhere else. 30 Duces Regi, or royal generals, battled on his side at the Battle of the River Wind. In spite of the fact that there are substantial spaces in the information, it appears that the 7th century Mercian kings were powerful rulers who had the ability to use broad overlordship from their midland base. Mercian army success was the structure of their supremacy. It beat 106 kings and kingdoms, not just by winning set-piece fights, but also by ruthlessly ravaging any area that refused to pay tribute. This part of Mercian army policy is pointed out on numerous times in passing during the Bede's history. Penda is found wrecking Northumbria as far north as Bamburgh, and only Aidan's superhuman interference saves the town from overall destruction. In 676, Thelred brought off a comparable rampage in Kent, doing such havoc in the Rochester diocese that 2 later bishops needed to resign because of a lack of funds. These stories supply a distinct view into the truths of early Anglo-Saxon overlordship, and how a prevalent overlordship could be created in such a brief time. Other kingdoms in southern Britain were also impacted by Mercian expansionism by the middle of the 8th century. While the East Saxon homelords appear to have been untouched, the East Saxon dynasty appears to have lost control of London, Middlesex, and Hertfordshire to Theobald. The Mercian impact and track record peaked in the late 8th century, when the most effective European ruler of the time, Frankish king Charlemagne, acknowledged the Mercian king Offa's authority and treated him with respect, even if it was only flattery. Monasticism and learning. Michael Drought describes this period as the Golden Era, a time when learning, grown, and classical knowledge had a renaissance. The rise of monasticism and its appeal wasn't entirely internal, with continental impacts impacting Anglo-Saxon monastic life. In 669, the 8th Archbishop of Canterbury, Theodore, a Greek-speaking monk from Tarsus in Asia Minor, came in Britain. His co-worker, Hadrian, a Latin-speaking African by birth and former abbot of an abbey in Campania, joined him the following year, near Naples. One of their first jobs at Canterbury was to establish a school, and they rapidly brought in a swarm of students into whose heads they daily put the streams of pure guideline, according to Bede, writing some 60 years later. As evidence of their direction, Bede claims that some of their students who've lived till this time were as proficient in Greek and Latin as they were in their native tongue. Aldhelm isn't pointed out by Bede in this context, but we know from a letter written by Aldhelm to Adrian that he was just one of their students. Aldhelm wrote in a design that ended up being the fundamental style for centuries: wealthy, grandiloquent, and exceptionally challenging Latin. According to Michael Drought, Aldhelm was the best author of Latin hexameters in England, and potentially better than anybody else since, or at the very least up till John Milton. His work showed that even at the severe edge of Europe, intellectuals in England might be as erudite and polished as any European author. Throughout this time, the abbey's riches and power grew as popular families, perhaps out of power, relocated to monastic life. The double abbey was a distinct company formed by Anglo-Saxon monasticism, including a home of monks and a home of nuns living beside each other, sharing a church, but never ever connecting, and living separate lives of celibacy. Abbesses, who were some of Europe's most effective and prominent women, commanded these double abbeys. Built on held positions along rivers and ports, double abbeys accumulated massive riches and impact over many centuries. Successors were not separated, and were centers of art and research study. While Aldhelm was operating in Malmesbury, far in the north of England, Bede was busy writing a ton of works, getting a credibility during Europe, and showing that the English could write history and faith and also perform astronomical estimations for the dates of Easter, to name a few things. Chapter 3: The Anglo-Scandinavian Wars and West Saxon Hegemony. From the structures built by King Egbert in the first part of the century to the victories of King Alfred the Great in the last decades, Wessex rose to power in the 9th century. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells the story in broad strokes, while the records are written from a West Saxon perspective. On the day of Egbert's ascension to the kingdom of Wessex in 802, a Mercian ealdorman from the province of the Witching crossed the border at Kempsford, meaning to launch a raid into northern Wiltshire. The Mercian force was met by regional ealdormen, and the people of Wiltshire had the triumph. According to the narrates, Egbert went on to dominate the Mercian kingdom and all south of the Humber in 829. The chronicler adds Egbert's name to Bede's list of 7 overlords at this moment, specifying that he was the 8th king who was Bretwalda. Egbert's creation of a bipartite kingdom, according to Simon Keynes, was necessary just because it stretched during southern England and created an operating alliance between the West Saxon dynasty and the Mercian kings. In 860, the enduring sons of King Telwulf consented to join the eastern and western parts of the southern kingdom, though the union wasn't preserved without internal opposition, and in the late 870s, King Alfred won the Mercian submission under their ruler Thelred, who in other situations may have been styled a king, but who under the Alfredian program was seen as the ealdorman of his people. People from mainland Europe, especially Danes and Norwegians, were drawn to the abbeys because of their wealth and the successes of Anglo-Saxon civilization. Just because of the ransacking raids that followed, the raiders earned the name Viking, originated from the Old Norse viking, which means exploration, which was quickly applied to any raiding or pirate action recorded in Western Europe. Lindisfarne was robbed in 793, and while it wasn't the first of its kind, it was the most well-known. Jarrow, where Bede rode, was attacked in 794. Iona was assaulted in 795, and the nunnery at Lymming, Kent, was enabled sanctuary behind the walls of Canterbury in 804. A reeve from Portland, Wessex, was killed around 800 when he misinterpreted some raiders for common tradespersons. Viking raids lasted till 850, when the heathen for the first time stayed throughout the winter season, according to the Chronicle. The fleet doesn't appear to have remained in England for long, but it did set a precedent that others followed. The army that came in 865 in particular remained for many winter times, and a part of it later colonized what ended up being called the Danelaw. The Chronicle in England and Adreveld of Fleury on the continent described this force as the Great Army. The intruders had the ability to benefit from fights between and within the kingdoms, selecting puppet kings like Ceolwulf in Mercia in 873, and perhaps others in Northumbria in 867, and East Anglia in 870. The third stage was a period of settlement, but the great army travelled any place the best pickings were, crossing the English Channel when confronted with determined opposition, like in England in 878, or hunger, like on the continent in 892. The Vikings were being progressively essential as drivers of social and political change at this moment. They worked as a typical adversary, instilling in the English a sense of country identity that went beyond much deeper departments. They could be considered as an instrument of magnificent penalty for the people's sins, instilling a sense of a typical Christian identity, and, by dominating the kingdoms of the East Angles, Northumbrians, and Mercians, they left a management vacuum. In 877, Danish settlements were developed in Mercia, and in 879-80 and 896 in East Anglia. In the meantime, the remainder of the army went on to harry and ransack on both sides of the Channel, with new employees coming to boost the army's numbers, as it stayed a strong fighting force. Alfred at first reacted by offering to pay a series of homage payments. Alfred, on the other hand, set up a strong battle after a definite triumph at Edington in 878. Other than for those warriors who were to garrison the burhs, he built a line of fortresses during the south of England and restructured the army, such that always half its men were at home and half out on service, and in 896 ordered the building and construction of a new form of warship, effective in fighting Viking longships in shallow seaside waters. When the Vikings returned from the continent in 892, they found that they could no longer pass through the country at will, as they were met by a regional force any place they went. After 4 years, the Scandinavians broke up, with some settling in Northumbria and East Anglia, and the rest going back to the continent to try their luck. Chapter 4. England's Development and Reform. Throughout the 10th century, the West Saxon kings broadened their supremacy, initially over Mercia, then into the southern Danelaw, and ultimately over Northumbria, enforcing a form of political unity on tribes who, regardless of their distinctions, knew their own civilizations and histories. The monarchy's credibility and pretensions grew. Federal government organizations grew more powerful, and kings and their representatives made each effort to enforce social order in a range of ways. This process started with Edward, the senior citizen, who together with his sister, Tefeld, woman of the merchants, advised people to purchase estates from the Danes to restore some degree of English impact in land that had come under Danish rule, according to charters. According to David Dumville, Edward could have continued this technique by rewarding his followers with land gifts in newly won Dane lands, and that any charters released in connection with such transfers haven't made it through. Mercia was soaked up by Wessex after Ethelred passed away. There was no defend the throne after that. Because of this, the home of Wessex ended up being England's ruling home. Edward the Senior was followed by his child, Telstan, whom Keynes refers to as an imposing figure in the 10th century landscape. His triumph over a union of his challengers, Constantine, Queen of the Scots, Owen ap Dymphal, King of the Cumbrians, and Olaf Guthfridsson, King of Dublin, at the Battle of Brunanburh, honored in a tune in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, enabled him to be acknowledged as England's first king. Thelstan's legislation shows how the king forced his officers to perform their obligations. He was unyielding in his need for devotion to the law. Nevertheless, this legislation shows the king's and his councillors continuous obstacles in bringing an unpredictable population under control. His claim to the title of King of the English wasn't generally accepted. The circumstance was complex. The Hiberno-Norse rulers of Dublin still wanted their interests in the Danish kingdom of York. Arrangements needed to be reached with the Scots, who could not only interfere in Northumbrian affairs, but also block a line of communication between Dublin and York. And the people of northern Northumbria were considered laws unto themselves. Following the death of Thelstan in 939, a merged kingdom of England handled its acknowledged shape only after 20 years of substantial advances. The obstacle of ruling over the north stayed the significant political concern for Edmund and Eadred, who followed Thelstan. Edgar is referred to as the Peacemaker, and is said to have been successful to the throne both in Wessex and in Mercia and in Northumbria, and he was then 16 years of age. After an entire decade of Edgar's peace, it might have appeared that the Kingdom of England had been made entire by the early 970s. The king prompted his bishops, abbots, and abbesses to be of one mind as issues monastic use, lest varied ways of observing the customs of one rule and one country might drag their holy discussion into contempt, in his main address to the assembly at Winchester. The court of Athelstan had been a fertile ground for ideas. Two young guys called Dunstan and Thelwood were made priests in that court, presumably at Athelstan's demand, right at the conclusion of his rule in 939. Between 970 and 973, a council assembled under Edgar's auspices to prepare a set of policies that would use during England. For the first time, all monks and nuns in England underwent a single set of accurate customs. Edgar received a unique second royal crowning and bath in 973, and England was governed by Edgar from that point on with the help of Dunstan, Athelwold, and Oswald, Bishop of Worcester. Chapter 5. Specifics from Society. The development of Anglo-Saxon kingship is inadequately comprehended, though York offered a design that connected the development of kingdoms and the jotting down of oral law codes to a series of leaders, providing mund and making recognition. Those 6th century leaders achieved success in taking the effort and developing a position of authority for themselves and their descendants. Simply because they were not able to tax and push their subjects, Anglo-Saxon rulers took surplus by raiding and gathering food renders and eminence products. The reduction of accompanied burial and the development of the first handsome burial places and high-status communities signified the end of an eminence products economy in the late 6th century. The most widely known example of a handsome burial is the ship burial in Mount 1 at Sutton Hoo, or Suffolk, which includes costly metalwork and feasting devices and could be the tomb of King Raildwald of East Anglia. Those commerce and commercial centers suggest the increased socio-political stratification and territorial power that allowed 7th century elites to extract and rearrange surpluses much more successfully than their 6th century predecessors could. Simply put, Anglo-Saxon society looked considerably different in 600 than it did a century before. The first Anglo-Saxon emporia appears to have been developed around 600. London, Ipswich, York, and Hamwick are the only 4 primary archaeologically verified wicks in England. Hodges saw these as strategies of majestic power over the import of status products instead of the center of real trade. In spite of historical proof of majestic participation, emporia are now typically viewed as real spots of trade and exchange, and also an arrival at urbanization. Bede's use of the term imperium has been viewed as vital in developing the Bretwalda's rank and abilities. In fact, it is an expression Bede used regularly as a replacement for regnum. Academics presume this just represented the collection of homage. Oswia's extension of overlordship over the Picts and Scots is shown as a tributary system. Military overlordship has its benefits in terms of short-range successes and cash, but it also has its disadvantages. A lot of the overlords only enjoyed their power for a quick time. To turn a tribute-paying under-kingdom into an irreversible acquisition, like the Bernician absorption of Deira, mindful structures needed to be built. The lower kingdoms didn't disappear when they were taken into bigger areas. Rather, their territorial stability was protected when they ended up being ealdormanries, or areas of ealdormanries inside their new kingdoms, depending upon their size. The county boundary of Sussex is generally the exact same as that of the West Sussex Shire and the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, showing this propensity for later limits to reproduce earlier plans. The Witan, also called Witenagemot, was a king's council whose main function was to counsel the king on all subjects for which he was consulted. It validated his property transfers to churches and lay people, consented to his enactment of new laws or statements of old custom, and helped him in handling rebels and tough dissidents. Only 5 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are known to have made it through to the year 800, and other British kingdoms in the nation's west had also disappeared. The bigger kingdoms had developed by obtaining lower principalities, and one of the crucial problems of the Middle Saxon period is how they achieved it, and the character their nations obtained as a result. In spite of its impressive nature, Beowulf plainly mentions that financial and army expertise were inextricably interwoven. A good king was a generous queen who got support through his cash, guaranteeing his supremacy over surrounding kingdoms. The Church and religious belief. Although Christendom controlled the Anglo-Saxons' spiritual history, pagan spiritual customs with a Scandinavian Germanic origin controlled life in the 5th and 6th centuries. Pagan Anglo-Saxons worshipped a range of places during their landscapes, some of which seemed purpose-built temples, and others which were natural geographical functions like as holy trees, hills, or wells. Those spots of praise were called either Hyrk or Woe, according on name proof. Most of pre-Norman conquest poems are rich in pagan importance, and their assimilation into the new faith extends past literary sources. Subsequently, as Lethbridge indicates, it's an irrational mindset to argue. This monolith was created throughout Christian times, so the meaning on it should be Christian. The practices of the former faith, which are now considered superstitious, are however practiced across the nation. It did not mean people weren't Christians, it just meant they saw a lot of reasoning in the old beliefs too. The horse was revered in early Anglo-Saxon society. A horse could have been a good friend of the divine being Wodan, and or they could have been God's confidants according to Tacitus. Horses, specifically Odin and Freyr, were highly related to gods. Horses played a considerable role in both funerary and other rites. Horses were a well-known fertility signs, and there were many horses fertility cults. Horse battles, burials, horse meat intake, and horse sacrifice are amongst the rites related to these. Horses were related to Hengist and Horsa, the legendary forefathers of the Anglo-Saxons, and recommendations to horses might be found during Anglo-Saxon literature. Horse burials are unusual in England, and it could show continental impact. Mount 17 at Sudden Hoo, some yards from the more well-known ship burial in Mount 1, is a widely known Anglo-Saxon horse burial. A man's body was found beside a full horse in harness, with a pail of food by its head in a 6th century burial place at Lakenheath, Suffolk. The story of Cnumon, the cowherd who ended up being the dad of English poetry, as told by Bede, is at the heart of the Anglo-Saxons' conversion from paganism to Christianity. According to Bede, here was a particular brother specifically significant for the grace of God in this abbess's abbey, who loved making spiritual verses, so that whatever was translated to him out of Bible, he right after put the exact same into poetical expressions of much sweet taste and humbleness in Old English, which was his native language. Most people were motivated to dislike the earth and desire paradise due to his verse. Cnumon's story exhibits the mixing of Christian and Germanic, Latin and oral custom, abbeys and double abbeys, pre-existing practices and new learning, well-known and elite, that identified Anglo-Saxon history and civilization during the conversion period. Standard Anglo-Saxon poesy isn't damaged or overlooked by Cnumon. Rather, he changes it into a tool for the church. Anglo-Saxon England tries to fix up the church's religious beliefs with existing northern customs and habits. As a consequence, the Anglo-Saxons' conversion was more than just a relocation from one practice to another. It was also the creation of something new from their old inheritance and new beliefs and understanding. Anglo-Saxon Christian life focused on monasticism instead of the church. Since the time of the Desert Fathers, Western monasticism had been developing. But in the 7th century, monasticism in England dealt with a predicament that cast doubt on the most precise representation of the Christian faith. The Celtic and Roman monastic customs were compared, and it was determined to follow the Roman custom. All spiritual parishes aside from the bishops seems described as abbeys. Dunstan brought Athelwold to Glastonbury in the 10th century, when the two established a Benedictine abbey. For several years, this was England's only Benedictine abbey that complied with the Benedictine guideline and preserved complete monastic discipline. At Glastonbury, what Methchild Gretsch described as Aldhelm's workshop emerged, and its effect on the curriculum of learning and research study in Anglo-Saxon England was considerable. The reforming impulses of Dunstan and Athelwold were backed by nobler power, which assisted them in imposing their reform ideal visions. This occurred at first at Winchester's Old Minster, before the reformers built new structures and refoundations in areas like Thorney, Peterborough, and Ely. The works of Aldhelm were at the center of their curricula, but they were also affected by Alfred's vernacular efforts. Benedictine abbeys spread out during England, and these ended up being centers of learning again, run by people trained in Glastonbury with one rule: the works of Aldhelm were at the center of their curricula. A spectacular flowering of literary creation emerged from this mix. Chapter 6: Women, Warfare, and Other Aspects. The Anglo-Saxons had a unique way of handling some social problems. Let's talk about those in this chapter. Warfare. Soldiers were summoned from all over the land to fight in both offending and defensive wars. Early armies were mostly made up of home bands, but later armies were hired on a territorial basis. The mustering of an army, which took done regularly at periods, played a necessary role in Frankish army and constitutional history. There appears to have been no organization like this in the English kingdoms. Bede's tale of Redwald, overlord of the southern English, defeating the Northumbrian Thelfrith is the first recommendation. Not enabling him time to gather and assemble his whole army, Redwald met him with a far more powerful force, and butchered him on the Mercian verge on the east bank of the river Idle, according to Redwald. When the Danes amazed Alfred at Chippenham after Twelfth Night at the Battle of Edington in 878, Alfred got away to Athelney after Easter, and after that summoned an army at Egbert's Stone 7 weeks later. It's simple to see Alfred sending out word to the Ealdorman to summon his men to fight. That could clarify the hold-up. Just because the army gathered around the start of May, when there would have been a lot of pasture for the horses, is more than likely a coincidence. There is added information about the 11th century mustering of fleets. Sometimes between 992 and 1066, fleets were gathered in London or gone back to the city at the end of their service. The area of their station was determined by the quarter from which an intrusion was expected. Sandwich if the risk originated from the north, or the island of Wight if it originated from Normandy. These armies and fleets needed to be provided with food and clothes for the soldiers, and hay for the horses after they departed home. In spite of the presence of servants and a supply train of lower free men in the army of the 7th and 8th centuries, Alfred found these plans inadequate to conquer the Vikings. He split his army resources into thirds as one of his reforms. One part manned the burhs and found the irreversible forts that would stop the Danes from overrunning Wessex, though they would also go to the field when additional men were needed. The remaining two would alternate serving responsibilities. They were given a set period of service and were needed to bring all of the vital supplies. a department on duty, once returned home while blockading a Danish army on Thorney Island. Its arrangements had gone out and its term had passed away before the king showed up to alleviate him. This division and rotation approach stayed in use till 1066, when Wessex and Mercia soldiers were in the field from early April to late November in 917. One division returned home and another took control of. When Edward's fleet got to Sandwich in 1052 to stop Godwine's return, the ships went back to London to hire new earls and men. The relevance of supplies, which is critical to army success, was acknowledged, despite the fact that it was taken for granted and only appears in passing in the sources. Servants, women and children. Whether as abbesses of the huge double abbeys of monks and nuns, set up during the 7th and 8th centuries, as significant landholders noted in Domesday Book 1086, or as routine members of society, women in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms appear to have had significant independence. They were considered oath-worthy, with the right to protect themselves on oath against incorrect allegations or claims. They could serve as principals in legal transactions, had the exact same wheregild as men of the exact same class. Sexual and other criminal offenses against women were badly penalized. Even wives have been known to hold property by themselves, and some making it through wills are in the joint names of couples. Marriage was governed by an agreement between the woman's family and the potential groom, who was obliged to pay a bride price in advance of the wedding event and an early morning gift after the wedding event. The latter became her personal effects, though the previous could have been paid to her family members at the very least in the start. With inheritance rights, custody of their children, and jurisdiction over dependents, widows were in particularly helpful position. Nonetheless, guidelines stressing that they are supposed to not be pushed into nunneries or second marital relationships against their will might show their vulnerability. Primogeniture, inheritance by the firstborn male, wasn't introduced to England till after the Norman conquest. Because of this, Anglo-Saxon brothers or sisters, both boys and girls, had more equal status. A child would lawfully acquire property or be held accountable for a criminal offense at the age of bulk, which was typically 10 or 12 years of age. Promoting children, either in other homes or in abbeys, was prevalent, probably as a way to extend in the circle of defense outside the kin group. Orphan children and foundlings are also secured by the law. The age-old social divide between free men was earl and ceorl, earl and churl. However, following the Viking period, the name earl handed a more limited meaning. In the early ages, nobles were called geishas, buddies, or egnas, thanes, with the latter being the most typical. The term thane was equivalent to the Norman baron after the Norman conquest. Laws specifying the requirements under which a ceorl ended up being a thane indicate a particular amount of social movement. Again, regional variations are possible, but one file points out owning 5 hides of land, about 600 acres, a bell and a castle gate, and also a seat and a certain office in the King's Hall. In the structure of district authority, Frank Stanton says that a merchant who had performed 3 journeys at his own charge had also been acknowledged since the status, according to an 11th century source. Loss of status might also happen, just like chastening slavery, which could be caused not just on the criminal but also on his spouse and family. Slavery and freedom were another difference in Anglo-Saxon civilization. Slavery wasn't as extensive as it was in other societies, but it appears to have existed eventually at the time of the period. Servants and freemen were both hierarchically arranged, with several classes of freemen and many range of servants. The king, the nobleman or thegn, and the typical freeman or ceorl were the most popular ranks within free civilization at different times and in different areas. They were distinguished mainly by the value of their wereldgeld, or man cost, which was used as the basis for different legal solutions, like the value of the oath that they may swear in a law court, and also the amount payable in payment for murder. Servants had no wereldgeld because criminal offenses against them were considered criminal activities against their owners. But the first laws developed a thorough scale of charges based upon the sort of servant and the status of the owner. Some servants might have been members of the regional British population who were ruled over by the Anglo-Saxons when they came from the continent. Others might have been taken in early kingdom disputes or cost food at the time of starvations. Slavery, on the other hand, wasn't always long-term, and freed men right below the rank of ceorl entered in an underclass of freedmen. Language. The earliest variation of the English language is Old English, Nigelis, Anglius, Englis. Anglo-Saxon intruders introduced it to Britain, and was spoken and written in parts of what's now England and southeastern Scotland till the mid-12th century, when it developed into Middle English. Old English, like Old Frisian and Old Saxon, was a West Germanic language, Old Low German. With 5 grammatical cases, 3 grammatical characters, and 3 grammatical genders, the language was completely inflected. Northumbrian, spoken north of the Humber, Mercian, spoken in the Midlands, Kentish, spoken in Kent, and West Saxon, spoken during the south and southwest. In modern-day England, all of these dialects have direct descendants. Just because the Mercian dialect prevailed in London, requirement English progressed from it. Kinship. Anglo-Saxon civilization focused on kinship ties, both regional and extended. Kinship sustained social advantages, independence, and elite relationships, enabling Anglo-Saxon civilization and language to flourish. Loyalty to a lord was based upon his individual instead of his position. There was no real sense of patriotism or commitment to a cause. Simply because a kingdom was only as strong as its leader king, this clarifies why dynasties fluctuated so promptly. There was no underlying administration in place to keep any gains after a leader passed away. The management of Redwald of East Anglia is an example of this, as the East Anglian primacy didn't endure his death. Just under amazing circumstances could kings enact new laws. Rather, they were accountable for promoting and clarifying previous practices, ensuring his subjects that he would appreciate their historic benefits, laws, and customs. Though the king's individual could be glorified as a leader, the office of kingship wasn't yet as effective or as endowed with authority as it would end up being. One of the tools kings used was to bind themselves to the recently established Christian church by having a church leader anoint and crown the king. In people's understandings, God and king were so connected. You have been listening to Anglo-Saxons, History of the Germanic Inhabitants of England. Written by Callie Maas and narrated by Chris Newman.